Chapter 16 of the Gospel of Luke contains what's been called one of Jesus' strangest parables, a tale of a rich man with a clever manager who wiggles his way out of economic and social ruin. Here's how it goes. There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that man was squandering his property. So he summoned him, and he said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer." And the manager said to himself, "What will I do? Now that my master is taking the position away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do so that when I'm dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes." So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, "How much do you owe the master?" He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, make it 50. Then he asked another, "How much do you owe?" He said, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, "Take your bill, make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. I think it's safe to say that this text is not one of the top 10 most popular texts to preach about. Personally, I don't remember hearing many sermons or even reading many devotional texts about it. What I do remember is a vague emphasis on forgiveness, which spiritualized the economic aspects of the text. It bordered on the allegorical. The rich man, that became a symbol of God. The manager, that was a symbol of all us good Christian folks. And the debt became a symbol for sin. The moral of the story was that we needed to learn to forgive each other, just as God forgives us. That's nice, right? The line about not being strong enough to dig was used to condemn any kind of salvation by works, although I don't remember the line about being ashamed to beg being similarly applied to salvation by grace. I suspect that this interpretation was often chosen because the preacher was simply unfamiliar with any other interpretation. Or, if the economic aspects were understood, they might lead to conclusions that would be considered too political or socialist, communist lies. I don't intend this in a mean-spirited way. I felt the same pressures. Even one of the lectionary resources I generally trust, while emphasizing that wealth is not neutral, focused on the importance of being good stewards in this life so that we could be trusted with eternal life. In our defense, we are perhaps encouraged to rush past the parable by the verses that follow, which ask, "If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches?" But that's where I always got stuck. Because what if the story really was about money and debt and justice in this world? After all, both Hebrew and Christian scriptures teach that how we relate to money and to wealth and how we treat each other is a faithful reflection of our capacity to love. The texts are filled with stories and teachings condemning those who hoard wealth and extolling those who practice generosity and justice. And that's consistent all the way across the tradition, from Deuteronomy, where we read, "If there is among you anyone in need, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand, willingly lending enough to meet the need, whatever it may be." To 1 John, when we're asked, "How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses to help?" With that broader context in mind, I think we can look more closely at the economic realities of first century Palestine. But here again, we may immediately get stuck before we can even get started. At least in the Christian traditions with which I'm most familiar, there's a common obstacle to even beginning the inquiry, and that is that tendency to associate the rich man with God. Once that assumption is made, even subconsciously, it can be difficult to look closely at the real economic situations of the day, because the rich man is not a heroic character. It's not exactly flattering to associate the divine with a greedy, usury, cruel exploiter. So for the sake of exploration, I'll ask all of us to put that assumption aside. and give us a chance to think about the rich man as just a rich man. He was an elite. He needed a manager, and he needed a manager for good reason. He had huge contracts to oversee. Scholars estimated that around 150 trees would have been needed to produce the approximately 900 gallons of olive oil that were noted in the story. And you would have to have about 100 acres to grow the wheat mentioned in the parable, a sum that equaled more than 7 years a common person's wages. As these contracts made up just a part of the business, the hearers would understand that this rich man was a big deal and part of the ruling class. That class would have included political elites, along with some retainers and wealthy merchants, and below them would have been more retainers, more merchants, the peasants and the artisans, and at the very bottom were what Dr. Bill Herzog called the expendables. Those were most commonly the day laborers, a position so unstable and uncertain that it inspired not a few to take up a life of banditry, and in any case, most of them died within 7 years. Only the cruelty of the system replenished their numbers. This is why Herzog described agrarian societies as agonistic societies. The elites were constantly struggling with one another to get ahead, not minding who was crushed underneath them as they climbed upward and upward. Rulers would use that competition to their advantage to, in Herzog's words, to divide the ruling class and promote factions favorable to them over others that were not. And they balanced that strategy with their dependence on the skills and knowledge of elites and their retainers to maintain the system. Herzog called it building a bureaucracy with operatives drawn from the retainer class in ways that expanded their own powers while trying to limit the growth of others' powers. It was a top-heavy system, with the top 2% controlling about 2/3 of society's wealth. The retainers, even though there were only a few of them, probably about 5% of the society, of the population, they were essential in helping the elites maintain that kind of control across huge social and economic disparities. They also provided a buffer between the elites and those they exploited. So while the retainers were able to access some of the wealth and rewards, the proverbial crumbs from the rulers' tables, they were also the easy targets of popular hostility and violence. They were, after all, the agents of redistribution, helping transfer the little the poor had to the elite's ever-expanding hoard. The manager in Jesus' story was a part of all that, a part of the system. The fact that he would be dismissed meant that he was a retainer and not a slave. What we witness in the story is the manager grappling with the reality that he might lose his place, his very precarious place in society. His options terrified him, and not merely because he thought digging a ditch or begging for food was beneath him. That could have been the case, but the reality was also harsher than that. Losing his position would have meant dropping into that other class, the expendables, where he would have to compete with others who knew what they were doing there better than he did. And the life expectancy, as I mentioned, of even the most successful was very low. This was quite literally a life or death situation. So remember the story's start. There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. Where would such charges come from? The retainer was caught between the rich man and his debtors. How could he possibly keep both parties pleased, especially if he was also going to take his own expected cut, the honest graft that made up his livelihood? This was a rotten system, with no one innocent, but with clear winners and losers, clear oppressed and oppressors. Suspended between the rich man's greed and the debtor's envy, the manager was constantly vulnerable to the whims of both. The debtors accuse him, the rich man dismisses him, and the manager's life hangs in the balance. His back against the wall, the manager found a way to use the system to his advantage, to save both his job and his life. Herzog goes into the details, and I encourage you to read his book, Parables as Subversive Speech, if this analysis interests you at all. But the strategy was brilliantly simple. Instead of protesting his dismissal, begging for mercy from the rich man, the manager decided to act. He acted before his dismissal would be public knowledge, while the rich man awaited the final financial accounting. Instead, the manager summoned the debtors one by one and renegotiated their contracts. Not daring to hope he would keep his job, the manager more realistically hoped that his quick thinking would make his services attractive to another ruling family. But the strategy ended up putting the rich man in a tricky position. If he renounced the manager and insisted on keeping the original contracts, the debtors might turn their anger toward him. But if he accepted the new contracts and kept the manager, he could maybe receive those renewed obligations of the debtors. In Herzog's words, when the patron gives, he also indebts. And those obligations turned out to be more valuable to the rich man in the long term and worth some short-term losses. That is the context of the rich man's praise. The manager wasn't being generous. He was being shrewd. And both the rich man and the manager belonged to and benefited from a cruel, exploitive system. And the rich man recognized the value of having a steward around who understood how that system worked and could navigate it so cleverly. If you're someone who cares about justice and peace, that's not praise you'd be eager to receive, because this is not a happy story. This is a story that reflects a deep understanding of the cruel economic situations that people faced every day. The parable honestly acknowledges the precarious lives of expendables, laborers, peasants, and even retainers, while also hinting at, or maybe better, aching for, the possibility of something else, a world beyond debt. There are large gulfs between the world of this parable and the world we live in today. But read this way, Jesus' parable is much more relevant and useful than the spiritualized version I heard as a child, at least to me. Although our economic systems are very different, we can still connect with the experiences of those first century listeners. A 2019 survey by Pew Research Center found that 69% of U.S. respondents said that our economy was all about helping the rich while harming the poor. About 2/3 of lower income and even 1/3 of middle income Americans worried about how they were going to pay their bills every single day. This assessment was as close to nonpartisan as the United States gets these days, as the report noted that, quote, lower income Republicans were roughly 4 times as likely as those in the upper income tier to give the economy an only fair or poor rating. And this was in 2019 under the Trump administration. A big part of these disparities is, just like in Jesus' story, debt. From student loans to credit cards, medical debt, auto loans, payday loans, late fees, a combination or more. From 1999 to 2016, household debt in the USA ballooned from $4.6 trillion to $12.29 trillion. In 2018, 71 million people, almost 1/3 of the U.S. residents with a credit history, had some form of debt in collection on their file. The most common reason for these debts was, as you can guess, a financial shock, a reality that unmasks the economic fragility of so many of us who live just one catastrophe away from financial and social ruin. According to the Pew Trust, 40% of adults reported that, quote, they would not have enough cash to cover an emergency expense costing $400, and 1 in 3 families reported having no savings at all. Medical debt can be particularly devastating and accounts for more than half of all collections activity. For many, the only choices are to sell their personal property, go into debt, or both. Given that situation, you would think that the obvious solution would be to address those disparities, right? No, of course not. It was not to change and provide more sustainable, healthier living circumstances, but to profit off of human tragedy. Buying debt became a lucrative industry. During that same time period, from 1993 to 2013, the total dollar value of debts purchased by debt buyers grew from $6 billion to $98 billion. And collecting money is not generally an easy or pleasant job. And so you can understand why businesses would have preferred to pass that task on to someone else. But the collection agencies that were making a fortune off of buying up these debts came to prefer the tactic of taking a debtor to court. According to the Pew Trust, two of the largest publicly traded debt buyers, Encore Capital and Portfolio Recovery Associates, saw their legal collections grow 184% and 220% respectively from 2008 to 2018. Lawsuits became so common that debt claims doubled from 1993 to 2013, making up almost 25% of all civil court cases in that time. In the most recent data available to us, that trend has continued. For instance, debt claims in Texas more than doubled from 2014 to 2018, topping 30% of the civil caseload. More than 70% of these lawsuits are resolved with what is called a default judgment, often because the debtor does not appear in court. There are reasons why someone might miss an important court appearance, but the one I'm most personally familiar with is that they never even received a summons. For example, a collection agency might not even have the most current contact information of a debtor. That doesn't necessarily slow down the proceedings. In my own experiences, I started receiving text from a collection agency who were trying to contact the past owner of my new phone number. I tried several times to contact the collection agency, tell them that the person they were trying to reach was not at my number. They didn't seem to mind or to care, and they continued to text me over and over again for some time. The texts finally stopped, but I've never stopped wondering about the fate of that phone number's past owner. I hope they are well. In other cases, respondents could not afford to take off work, or couldn't get transportation to court, or were simply overwhelmed and confused by the idea of a lawsuit. Remember, the most common trigger for a debt of this nature is a financial shock, a situation that rarely leaves a person in the best circumstances for navigating a complex legal battle. But once that default judgment is issued, the debtor is usually in even more desperate circumstances. Every state, all 50 states, allows the court to award collectors interest on the debt. And many states also allow collectors to be reimbursed for attorney fees. And that can be devastating, as in the case of one defendant who was taken to court for a medical debt. And although she had successfully paid off $8,500 of an original $9,861 debt, the court ruled that she owed an additional $8,500 in interest. She basically had to start all over. Then, once the case is decided, the debt still has to be paid. To recover the money, a court may allow a collection agency to garnish wages or to issue property liens. In some cases, the debtor is even incarcerated. And although debtors' prisons were officially outlawed in 1833 when Congress abolished them, and the Supreme Court has judged numerous times that a person cannot be jailed for being unable to pay a debt, debt imprisonment continues. This is because a debtor can be held in contempt of court, such as for failure to appear, and the agency can request a civil arrest warrant, often under the guise of saying it's easier to collect a debt if we have the pressure of a warrant on the person. An arrest like this can create a new cycle of debt from lost wages or lost employment, or the new debt of having to pay cash bail or bonds to get out of jail. The shrewd manager in Jesus' story inhabited a very different world, but thinking about that world invites us to see our own in a different way. We have our own tiered economic system with no one innocent, but with clear winners and losers, oppressors and oppressed. We're invited to reflect on who our own society has made expendable, whose economic misfortunes have become a cautionary tale, but not a human worthy of compassion and justice. In reflecting on Jesus' parable, Herzog concluded that, clearly, the issue at the end of the parable is the cancellation or reduction of debt. The twisted machinations of debtors and desperate scheming of the steward led to a lowering of debt to which the master, for whatever reasons, consented. The result was a glimpse for the debtors of another order, one in which forgiveness of debt would be more than a petition and a prayer. I'm not saying this is the right interpretation or the only way to reflect on this passage, but it is a reflection that's worth our time because our own society needs to glimpse another order where forgiveness of debt is not spiritualized, but real. More accurately, we need a spirituality that does not separate economic needs from spiritual ones. And we need a society where true economic opportunity and security for every person, including policies that eliminate major debt sources, such as universal health care and education. Reflecting in this way, we too can glimpse and then do the work to co-create a world where no one has to worry if they're expendable, and everyone is valued, not for their potential for profit, but simply for this beautiful, complicated, incredible opportunity to be alive.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.